This is the first in a series of 3 presentations on the concept of Sunday laws in prophecy as part of the Central California Conference Prophecy Seminar Series. And so I'd like to begin by noting that this is a very popular Seventh-day Adventist belief. In fact, it's since COVID-19 that I've become aware how popular it is, because I've been able to do Zoom sessions with places like Bahamas, Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia, Europe, etc. And I'm finding, particularly outside the Western world, the number one topic right now is Sunday laws in Bible prophecy. And you might wonder why that would be. Some people are even telling me that's true in North America, at least in many of the local churches. And I think the reason that it's become kind of the number one topic is that I think it's seen as a key sign of the end, perhaps the sign of the end. Many signs of the end are, shall we say, a bit ambiguous. For example, the gospel will be preached to the whole world and then the end will come. Sounds pretty clear, but how will you know that the gospel has been fully proclaimed in your own neighborhood, much less in the rest of the world? But the idea of a Sunday law passed in a specific governmental building, the House of Congress in the United States, that is a measurable, clear statement of something to look for. And people say, when that comes, I will know that the final events are getting near. And in fact, in the general understanding, it's not just Sunday laws in the United States, but worldwide. And that what happens in the United States will trigger the rest. So that's what I'm discovering as whatever topic I speak on, that's the question that people always want me to come to in the end. The problem is, though, fixing on such a detail when you have the whole ocean of Scripture to study can result in quite a bit of imbalance. And so I thought that taking a careful look at this topic, first of all, taking a look at the biblical principles that we find in prophecy. Sunday laws are unfulfilled prophecy as of yet, and in the Bible, studying fulfilled prophecy to see how God moves from prophecy to fulfillment will help us have the right response to unfulfilled prophecy when the time comes. So we'll begin with some prophetic principles in this session. In the session to follow, we'll take a look at the key biblical text, which is Revelation 13 and verses 13 to 17. And then in the final presentation, we'll look at the key statements in the writings of Ellen White, The Spirit of Prophecy, and see exactly what it is she said about the biblical text and about the topic, and draw some conclusions from there. As we begin, though, I want to just share with you one important background, and that is the difference between a believer and a scholar. You see, I'm both of those. I'm a believer. I believe in the Scriptures. I believe in the Seventh-day Adventist Church and its mission. I believe in the writings of Ellen White, and I believe that God used her. And as a believer, you make certain commitments, even though you may not have absolute proof. You may not have 100% evidence for everything that you believe. Believers make commitments. The job of the scholar is to be constantly testing the evidence for those commitments and seeking to improve on things, seeking to make things clearer, seeking to better understand the biblical text. Now, a good example is Uriah Smith in Revelation 13. As Uriah Smith laid out Revelation 13, he saw some of it in the Middle Ages and some of it at the end of time. I'm not sure that he actually carefully looked at the biblical text itself, but seems to be operating more from the way Seventh-day Adventists were thinking at the time. Well, when the General Conference had a Daniel and Revelation committee back in the 1980s, they asked me and others to help them study these issues, and we discovered that in Revelation 13, there's a shift of tenses between past and present and future. And when you study the passage in the light of the Greek text, you discover that the kind of shifts that Uriah Smith made actually do work in the text. But now we have a stronger biblical foundation for what we may have believed in the past. And so I think it's very important that to remember that as scholars we may test and question things not because we don't believe them, but because it's important to have the soundest arguments and the best understanding we possibly can. And as Ellen White herself said, if we've made some mistakes, it's time that we knew them. So we're going to do some scholarly work, but from the perspective of desiring to support an appropriate belief. So one thing that we've mentioned already is that we need to attend to unfulfilled prophecy. This is an unfulfilled prophecy, Sunday laws, the whole concept of the idea. How are you going to go from the prediction to the fulfillment? I think it's critical that we test the way we read these texts by how the Bible shows fulfilled prophecy to work. And I've done this work in the past, and if you're interested in much more detail than I can give you today, you can go to my book, What the Bible Says About the End Time. The entire book is, in a sense, looking at the biblical evidence for these principles, and I summarized them and updated them about 10 years after in chapter 2 of the book, The Deep Things of God. So you can get some of the depth there, but I'm going to give you just a quick overview of 8 principles of biblical interpretation drawn from fulfilled prophecies in the Bible. Now, the first of these is that God is consistent. Seems obvious at first glance, but that's sort of the foundation of prophecy. Prophecy works because God is consistent. What God says, He will do. What He does, He will do again. As it says in Malachi, I am the Lord, I do not change. So at the foundation of prophecy is the sense that God is consistent. We can count on Him to do what He says and also repeat what He has done in the past. But there's an interesting second principle that seems to go a bit against the grain, and that is that God is not always predictable. God isn't always predictable. In other words, not everything that God says He will do, He in the end does. Classic example, the book of Jonah. God says, 40 days, Nineveh will be destroyed. No conditions stated, no challenges there. Message is clear, prophet gives the message, 41st day comes, Nineveh is still there. And the prophet himself is upset with God because he realizes that when God makes a negative prediction, God is so merciful that if the conditions change, God will change with the situation. God loves His creatures, does not desire anyone to be lost. And so God will do all in His power not to carry out negative judgments when they occur. I think of Romans 11, verses 33 and 34, where it says, "Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable are His judgments, how inscrutable His ways. For who hath known the mind of the Lord, or who has been His counselor?" This cautions us that we should not be overconfident ahead of time, that we know the mind of the Lord, that we know exactly how He's going to fulfill the prophecy. John 3, verse 8 says, "The wind blows where it pleases. You hear its sound, but you cannot tell where it comes from or where it is going. So it is with everyone who is born of the Spirit." So you see that, in a sense, God is like the wind. We may think we know the future because of what prophecy says, but God resists that kind of reading. God says, I am still free to do what I do. So God is not always predictable. When prophecies are fulfilled, many times they fit every detail. But there are other times when not every detail of the pattern is carried out, and that is an important principle to keep in mind. Principle number 3 is that God is creative. In other words, God can do some things in fulfilling a prophecy that he hadn't actually told you he was going to do. God is creative. As the situation develops, God may develop new aspects to the prophecy and bring out deeper involvement. For example, Isaiah 43. In Isaiah 43, we see that the Exodus is a model for what God will do when he brings Israel out of Babylon. And so it goes into the model there, and it quotes a little from Exodus 15. But then in verses 18 and 19, it says, "Forget the former things. Do not dwell on the past. See, I am doing a new thing." So God says it's going to be like the Exodus and not. All right? So as we look forward to that future, we need to recognize that God is free to not carry out every detail of the pattern. He's also free to add new things to the pattern. In other words, prophecy is not given to satisfy our curiosity about the future. It's given to strengthen our faith and to teach us how to live as we prepare for the things that are coming. What's the scholarly evidence for what I've just shared with you, those 3 principles? God is consistent, God is not always predictable, God is creative. Well, I began with creation, the flood, and the Exodus. 3 great stories. And in those stories, you see God acting in very consistent ways. It's amazing how much what he does and how it's described in the Hebrew fits from one to the next. So much of the creation story is repeated in the flood story. The flood is a disintegration of creation and then a rebuilding of creation. And the language of Genesis 1 and 2 is repeated in Genesis 6 through 9. Then when you get to the Exodus, surprisingly, a lot of the language of creation is then repeated in the context of the Exodus itself. And so God is consistent, but not every detail of creation is carried out in the flood. Not every detail of creation in the flood is carried out in the Exodus. And God in the Exodus does some things he never did before that become models for his later activity in the prophets and with Jesus Christ. So we see in God's actions consistency, unpredictability, and creativity. In addition to that, when you go to the fulfilled prophecies, when you go to Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Malachi, etc., you can see the same 3 principles operating. God is consistent, God is not always predictable, and God is truly creative. Some more principles. Number 4, God meets people where they are. We sometimes think that prophecy is God taking a look at the future and projecting that future in detail to the prophet's mind. But what actually happens is God gives the prophecy to the prophet in a form that that prophet can understand. And so God meets people where they are. The great example of that is the 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's only one story of Jesus. There was only one Jesus. But there's 4 complete stories of Jesus, each of them different, because each of these Bible writers was different. And each of them framed the story of Jesus in the light of their own language, in the light of their own time and place, in light of their own background and understanding. This is illustrated, of course, in Jesus himself. He didn't come as a 21st century American. He didn't come as a medieval knight. He came as a first century Jew living in Galilee, speaking the language of Galilee, and being very much involved in the life and the customs of that particular time and place. God meets people where they are. Of course, the most classic example of that is Daniel 2 and Daniel 7, where you have 2 prophets, one a pagan king and the other a Hebrew prophet. To the pagan king, God gives the vision in the form of an idol, and to the Hebrew prophet, he gives it in the form of creation, the language of creation in Daniel 7. God met each of these men where they were. So we need to understand prophecies in terms of the time, place, and circumstances of the prophet, critical to the shape that the prophecy takes and how it will eventually be fulfilled. Principle number 5 is that God often spiritualizes history. In other words, he takes historical events, makes them a part of the prophecy itself, and then fulfills it not in a literal way, but he fulfills it in a spiritual way. And that is surprising. For example, in Revelation 13:15, you have the story of a death decree that worship this image or you will be killed. And your mind immediately goes back to Daniel 3. The story on the plain of Dura is the foundation for Revelation chapter 13. But in Revelation 13, it's not a particular location on earth, it's worldwide. And it's not a statue, but the image represents ideologies that are truly worldwide. So God takes the historical event as a model for something he does on a much grander scale in Revelation 13. Principle number 6 is related to number 4, where it says God uses the language of the prophets past and present. In other words, where the prophet is in point of history, God takes the language that makes sense to that prophet. So Isaiah's language is not Moses' language. It's not our language. It's the language appropriate to the time and place when Isaiah lived. Language, in a real sense, is a summary of our own personal history. Every word in our native language we learned as a child, in context. And so when we read the Bible, it's natural to read into the Bible in our native language the meanings and context that those words mean to us. But the prophet wrote in the prophet's time, place, language, and circumstances. And that's really critical to rightly understanding prophecy. Let's take a look at a classic example. And that's Isaiah chapter 11, verses 15 and 16. And the reason I'm going to give you this example is because there's no question this prophecy was fulfilled within the context of the Old Testament. The fascinating thing is not a single detail of this prophecy was fulfilled exactly as written. Did you hear me? Exactly as written. If you were to read this prophecy in Isaiah's day, you would say, the return from exile will happen like this. In fact, the details are so clear that you could make a prophetic chart and say, here's how it's all going to work out. But when it actually happened, it was very different. Let's take a look. Isaiah 11, verses 15 and 16. The Lord will dry up the gulf of the Egyptian sea. You see, he's using the Exodus as a model here for what's going to happen in return from exile. The Lord will dry up the gulf of the Egyptian sea. With a scorching wind, he will sweep his hand over the Euphrates River. He will break it up into 7 streams so that men can cross over in sandals. There will be a highway for the remnant of his people that is left from Assyria, as there was for Israel when they came up out of Egypt. All right, so Exodus is the model, and reading the text at face value, it's saying that Israel will return from exile to Assyria when God sends an east wind to dry up the Euphrates River, and God's people will escape across the dry riverbed, just like they went through the Red Sea, and make their way back to Israel. What a wonderful deliverance that will be. The reality is, not a single detail of this prophecy was fulfilled exactly as written. Why? First of all, let's go to verse 16. It is Assyria that is the captivating power, and it is Israel that are the captives. This is appropriate to Isaiah's day. Babylon was not a major power in Isaiah's day. In fact, it was subject to Assyria. And Israel was 12 tribes at the beginning of Isaiah's ministry. But by the time of the Babylonian exile, there's only one tribe, essentially, the tribe of Judah, that is left. So in the actual fulfillment, Judah leaves Babylon, not Israel leaving Assyria. But God meets Isaiah where he is. If he had given the details of what actually would occur, nobody would have made sense of it. Isaiah himself would say, this makes no sense. God meets people where they are and speaks their language in their time and place. But what about this other stuff? What about the Egyptian sea and the wind and the sandals? What about all of that? Well, part of the model is God uses the language of the prophets past to describe the future. And the language of Isaiah's past included the Exodus story in the books of Moses. And in the Exodus story, God uses a wind to dry up the Red Sea so that the Israelites can walk across in their sandals. That's the model. And he gives it to Isaiah as a model because that's part of his construct, part of his world, to foresee the future. But was it a wind that dried up the Euphrates when the people of God were delivered by Cyrus? No, it was Cyrus' engineers that dried up the river. And was the river dried up so the people of God could escape across the riverbed? No, they escaped across the bridges because the new emperor told them they could go. They were free. You see, the prophecy was fulfilled. But if you had nailed down the details and said, this is the way it's got to be fulfilled, you would not have seen the fulfillment when it came. God is consistent. God is not always predictable. God is creative. And he meets the prophet where they are using the prophet's past and present language to describe the future. And I humbly submit to you that Ellen White was a prophet like the biblical prophets. And if you believe that, then God is going to be operating under similar principles with her writings, which we need to attend to in a later session. So what I'm saying here is that I've learned in looking at fulfilled prophecies of the Bible that biblical prophecies are always a natural extension of the prophet's time and place. In other words, the events that happen between the prophet's time and the end are events that make sense from the world in which the prophet is speaking. God does not give them details that would make no sense, such as the fact that Babylon eventually conquers Assyria and becomes the hostile power that takes God's people captive, according to Isaiah 11. Principle number 7, and this should be obvious by now. Fulfillments of prophecy are always clearest as or after the fulfillment occurs. To project the fulfillment ahead of time does not always work. In other words, the prophecy wasn't given so that we could make charts. The prophecy wasn't given that every detail would be clear ahead of time. The prophecy was given so that when the fulfillment comes, it would strengthen our faith. And we would know, in fact, this is the fulfillment that was to come. That's always the clearest. And in case you don't believe me, let's take the words of Jesus. John 14:29. I have told you now before it happens, so that when it does happen, you will believe. The purpose of prophecy is faith. The purpose of prophecy is our commitment to God. It is not to satisfy our curiosity about the future and how curious we are. Jesus' disciples were curious. Lord, when is the temple going to be destroyed? What's the sign of your coming? We're all curious. And if it was for our good to have a detailed map of the future, we would have it. But the principles of fulfilled prophecy tell us that we can have a general idea of the future, but the detailed map is not good for us to know. Finally, the difference between apocalyptic and classical prophecy. 2 types of prophecy have been identified in Seventh-day Adventist study of the prophecies. Apocalyptic prophecy is like Daniel 2 and Daniel 7. Often comes in visions, and those visions are often symbolic visions, and they produce a series of events from the prophet's day to the very end. Apocalyptic tends to be sequential. It has more clarity when it comes to the far future than classical prophecy does. Classical prophecy, on the other hand, is like Isaiah, Hosea, Matthew 24, and similar Bible books. And classical prophecy is when God speaks very much within the immediate future of the prophet. It may have implications for the far future, but God is addressing the prophet in a specific time and place, describing that end in the context of the prophet's immediate future. So classical prophecy tends to be conditional, which means that not everything God says will happen because the conditions may change. In Last Day Events, page 38, Ellen White herself says, "It should be remembered that the promises and threatenings of God are alike conditional." That's one reason you can't predict on the basis of prophecies, because prophecies are usually conditional. There are some aspects of apocalyptic prophecy that are not conditional, like the second coming of Jesus. But many aspects of Bible prophecy, especially classical prophecy, are conditional, just like Jonah, once again. No hint that it's conditional, but clearly it was. And when the Assyrians repented, God said, "Good for them. I'm not going to carry out the judgment that I had predicted." So classical prophecies are conditional, and they're concerned with the immediate setting and the near future of the prophet. This, I think, will be very important for us when we take a look at what Ellen White has to say. It'll also be important for Revelation 13, because Revelation was given in the time, place, language, and context of a first century writer. Revelation was not given in the 21st century with our language and our way of thinking and talking. So to rightly understand both Revelation 13 and the predictions of Ellen White, we need to be very much aware of the principles of prophecy that we find when we look at fulfilled prophecies in the Bible. So let me summarize. And there you see it on the screen. God is consistent. God is not always predictable. God is creative. God meets people where they are. God spiritualizes history. God uses the language of the prophets past and present to describe the future. You need to know the language of the prophets past and present to rightly project the future. The fulfillments are clearest as or after they occur. And remember the distinction between classical and apocalyptic prophecy. I think we will see when we get into Ellen White's writings that she was very much a classical prophet rather than an apocalyptic prophet in terms of the things she says about Sunday laws, as we will come to see. So it's good to have been with you. That concludes our first session, and we will move on in the next session to take the same principles of prophecy and apply them to Revelation chapter 13, which is the foundation text for the idea of Sunday laws in the earth's future.